You're listening to the North Parkway Podcast, weekly talks designed to help you take the next step in your spiritual journey. You can learn more about our church at northparkway.org. And if these talks are helpful to you, consider using the link in the description to give. Your financial support helps us continue to make great content. All right, well, that's enough intro. Let's get to today's talk.
Hey, church family. As I was developing this week's talk, I had an idea. Rather than try to help get you into the mind of a historical figure, why don't I bring the historical figure and have him explain his emotions, his motivations, and then the scenario that he was in. Yes, today is going to be different. It's a dramatization. But as we go through today's talk, I want you to remember that the stories in the Bible are not just stories. They're actual events that happen to real people with real motives and emotions. So as we go through today's talk, I want you to unlock your imagination and hear from somebody who was there in the moment. There's a lot we can learn from him.
I only ever wanted to help. I wanted to help my people. I wanted to have a people. I lived in a different time than you, but things were not so different as you may think. In my time, some peoples thought of others as less than themselves. I was born as a Hebrew, but I was born in the land of Egypt. And when I was born, Hebrews were lesser humans. They were important to the economy, of course. We made all of the bricks for all of the great monuments. But we were somehow lesser than our Egyptian masters. And around the time that I was conceived, Hebrew boys were becoming a problem because there were so many of us. And so the king decided that we should all be destroyed. Well, thankfully, my mother was something of a rebel. And rather than destroy me, because she honored God, she set me in a basket and floated me down the river. And as fate, as God would have it, the daughter of the king had come down to the river to bathe. And in this small area where the water was a little more still, she saw a basket and heard a baby crying. And she took pity on me. And she pulled me out of the basket and she adopted me as her son. And she gave me the name. In my culture, it is Moshe. But in your language, you would know me as Moses. I grew up in a very different life than my brother who was older than I. I grew up in a very different life than my other people. I grew up in the lap of luxury. I lived in Pharaoh's home, the most powerful man in the world. I was educated. I learned to read and write. I learned science. I learned to watch the stars. I learned culture. I learned to shave my face like the other Egyptians and decorate my face like the other men of the culture. And I grew up in every way an Egyptian, every way except for one. Because I wasn't an Egyptian. You would have to be there to know the nose, the eyes, the hair, everything. It gave me away. And no matter how hard I tried to fit in, I was always the Hebrew boy. As a young man, I desired to know my people. I wanted to know who I really was and who I was from. And so I decided to go out and observe what was happening in the kingdom. And I saw an Egyptian master beating a Hebrew. He was an older man. He was weak, emaciated from being malnourished, and tired at the end of the day. I'm sure he was dehydrated. And this Egyptian taskmaster was whipping him mercilessly. And yes, it was an injustice and it frustrated me. But it was also a depiction of the inner struggle inside of me. Who was I really? Am I an Egyptian? Am I a Hebrew? There were times when I wanted one side to win out over the other, and somehow had both warring within me, and it made me so angry to watch one man beat another that I waited until he was done. And I followed the Egyptian. And I made sure no one was looking. And I grabbed the whip from him, and I decided I was going to teach him a lesson. And I whipped him. And I beat him. And as I did, it was a catharsis inside of me, because all of this pent-up rage and anger at my two natures, they all came out in the strokes. And I snarled as I beat him again and again. I beat him until he could no longer stand. I beat him until he no longer cried out. But I lost myself. And I beat him until he could no longer breathe. And it wasn't until I had already done it, it wasn't until I had gone too far that I realized I'd made a huge mistake. I killed him. And I panicked, so I buried him in the sand, and I hoped no one would know. And the next day I went out just as usual. I'm just the Prince of Egypt walking and observing. And the next day I saw one Hebrew man beating another, and I thought, we have enough problems with the Egyptians. I ran between them and I said, what are you doing? Stop. Why are you beating your brother? And the man turned and he looked at me and he said, who are you to judge me? Who decided that you're prince over me? Oh, I know who you are, Moshe. You think you're one of us? Get out of here. Or wait, he said. Do you intend to kill me like you killed the Egyptian yesterday? If you've ever had that moment where you're in a dream and suddenly you realize you're about to die and your heart stops, that was that moment. Oh no. He knows. Well, as you can imagine, in no time, the Pharaoh knew, and it's not hard to envision how much of a scandal across the nation the Hebrew boy invited into the king's palace, who became a murderer, was. Men were immediately sent to kill me, and I ran for my life. I ran from everything I had ever known. I ran until I didn't recognize where I was anymore, and I kept running. I was so exhausted emotionally and physically. And as I knelt down next to a small brook of water, I cried. I only wanted to help. I was trying to make things better. I never meant to go that far. There were not many advocates for the Hebrews in the land of Egypt. And I could have been one. I was in Pharaoh's court. I could have used my words. But instead I used my fists. And I tried to help, and I made things worse. Have you ever been there? Have you ever tried to help? Have you ever tried to make something better and it backfires horribly and you actually make things worse? I was a failure. So you could imagine then my surprise when many years later, the God of gods appeared to me. I had no question of whether it was a divine encounter. I had never heard from this God. I had heard about him. But he appeared to me on a mountainside and he said, Moses, I have seen the suffering of your people. I care very much about what's happening to them, and I have decided to do something about it. My heart leapt inside of my chest. Finally, we had begun to think that God no longer cared about our people. We remembered the promise to our ancestor Abraham, but it seemed like he didn't remember anymore. Well, he told me, Moses, I remember, and I'm going to do something. I'm going to cause the elders of Israel to rise up, and together with a new leader, they're going to go to Pharaoh and demand their release, and they will be released. They'll get their own country. They will be free, no longer slaves, a land of abundance and plenty. And that all sounded great until he told me who this new leader was supposed to be. Me? God, surely you are mistaken. Of all the people who could walk into Egypt, I'm a wanted man. I'm a criminal. I'm a failure. I have somehow been rejected both by my adopted family and by my people who I share genetic ancestry with. Why would anyone listen to me, God? No, you need someone else. But you should know this about the Lord. When he makes up his mind, he's not easily swayed. He said, no, Moses, it must be you. And I argued and I argued and I argued, but finally I relented. I said, okay. Because what else am I supposed to say to a burning bush? But okay, I'll go. He made promises to me, my friends. He made promises. He said, when you go to the elders of your people, they will hear you and they will support you. And when you go to the Pharaoh and ask for the release, he will release your people. And you'll no longer be slaves. You'll be able to do the help you always wanted to do. So I listened and I went. And if at first things went so well, I went to the elders and I told them, the God of our ancestors has spoken to me. He has revealed his name. Yahweh, I am, he said, his name is. And he's told me that he's heard the sufferings of our people and he is stepping in to help. And these hardened men, these weathered, leathered men who had worked so hard, they began to weep. Weep like babes. And we wept together at the thought that God heard and cared again. And I wept at the thought that my people had finally accepted me again. And together we would go and gain our freedom. For a while, things went well when I listened to God. We went to Pharaoh, and you should have seen the commotion. Can you imagine the conversations? Moshe, the former son of the Pharaoh, the murderer, the revolutionist, has returned. All of the younger people, they didn't know what was going on, but the older ones, they knew. Even with the beard, they recognized me. Moshe has returned. You could hear the whispers. You could feel the energy in Pharaoh's court. As I walked before him, he was very different than I remembered him, but I remembered his face. And I looked at him, and with courage that shouldn't have been inside of me, I said, the God of my ancestors has commanded me to lead my people into the wilderness so that we may worship him and sacrifice to him. You must let us go. You must give us time off from building the buildings, from making the bricks. You must allow us to go and worship him. And right there is where everything changed. Because up to that point, following God had been making everything better. Following the Lord's command had been working. But I saw on his face, before he opened his mouth, I saw the expression change. I saw the haughty, proud eyes. I saw the curl of his lip into a smirk, and he said, Yahweh? I've never heard of this Yahweh. I've never heard of your God. Why should I allow you to take all of my workers? How will I get anything done? Who are you to walk in here and demand anything of me? I do not know your God, and I will not listen to your God. Get out of my presence. That is not how the God of the burning bush described what would happen. Well, I left his presence. And as I went, Pharaoh turned immediately to his leaders and he said, listen, the problem with these Hebrews is that they're lazy. They think that we're just going to give them time off. No, I tell you, I'm going to make work harder for them. You see, we were brick builders. We were masons. And we didn't make bricks like your concrete today. We dried clay, but the clay in itself doesn't tend to hold together well, so you must mix straw in with it. Some of you know, what is it they say? Rebar inside of the concrete to hold it together. Well, that was straw in our bricks. And the way that we worked, the way that the economy worked, is that the Egyptians provided the straw from the fields, and the Hebrews baked them into bricks in the kilns. Pharaoh commanded all of his men and said, you need to tell these Egyptians, you need to tell all of those in leadership that the Hebrews must now collect their own straw to bake the bricks. Oh, and by the way, the quota remains. I need as many bricks as possible. Not one less, he said. Not one less. It was a crisis. See, you must understand, we were slaves. There were no workers' rights for us. There was no union for us. We worked sun up to sundown as it is, baking bricks. And my countrymen, my people, young men and old, in a panic, spread out across the country trying to find straw, and they couldn't find it in time. They began to fall behind in the quota. And their taskmasters whipped them mercilessly. Not just one, dozens, hundreds. I stepped in to help one man who was whipped. And now because of my words, hundreds were being beaten. The Hebrew foreman, in a desperate plea, asked to speak to Pharaoh. They went to the king and they said, sir, you must have mercy. How can you expect us to make the bricks and to make the quota when we must gather straw? Please, why are you doing this to us? Have we not served you faithfully? I didn't get to go inside of that meeting. My brother and I, we waited right outside the doors, but I could hear the desperation in their voices. I could hear the raised voices. I could hear the shouts. I knew something was happening. But Pharaoh, he told them why. He told them why the rules had changed. And as I waited nervously outside the courts of the king, my countrymen came out. I rushed up to them. Tell me, what did he say? And I wish I could convey the hate in his eyes. These same elders, these same people who had supported me just days earlier, I wish I could convey the feeling behind his eyes when he looked at me. He looked at me with such contempt and anger. And one of them, he walked up to me and he grabbed me by the cloak. And he said, it's because of you. It's your fault, Moshe. It's your fault that they're doing this to us. You and your words, you're meddling. You're trying to do something. You have put a sword in the hand of Pharaoh, and he has it at our necks to kill us. You've brought disaster on your people. He looked at me with hate in his eyes. I could smell the breath. He was right in front of me, and he said, I hope this God of yours judges you and condemns you for the evil you've done to your people. I had no words. I stood in shocked silence. And I watched them leave. This is not what God told me would happen. This is not how it was supposed to go. Why? I didn't understand. I was at a loss. Have you ever been there? Have you ever done what the Almighty has asked you to do? And instead of things in your life getting better, they got worse? Oh, I have. More than once. More than once I played the obedient servant. More than once I listened to the call and I said, yes, Lord, yes, I will do what you want. I only wanted to help. And instead, everything was about to fall apart. And I went and I got alone that night. I went far enough out of town where no one would hear me shouting because I was ready to shout. And I clenched my fist and I thrust it into the sky and I said, you, why? Why have you done this to me? Why did you send me to Egypt just to punish your people? You said you were going to help. Some of you are thinking, oh, I'm surprised you're not a pile of ashes. I was a little surprised too. In that moment, I was so angry, I didn't care. Smite me then. I don't understand. I told him, I said, ever since I came here, you have done nothing to help your people. Why have you behaved like this toward me? What did I ever do to you? And the Lord has allowed me to be here to speak with you because I want you to know how he responded to me. Because I believe that if you haven't had those times yet, you will. When you respond to what God has told you to do. And the things don't get better, they actually get worse. You may know this about me. I am a fan of writing things down. You may not realize there wouldn't be the first 5 books of your Old Testament if I hadn't written them myself, if I hadn't been trained in Pharaoh's house to know how to write. I believe in writing things down, and I have a few things that you should write down. The first one is this. When I was at my wit's end, when I didn't understand and I felt betrayed by God, and I called out to him and I questioned him, God did not rebuke me for asking. Write that down. Carry that with you. We'll put it up so you can see it. God didn't rebuke me for asking why. Some of you are thinking, oh, that's awfully bold of you. How dare you clench your fist and shake it to the sky in anger? I was angry. And here's what I learned about the Almighty. He has strong shoulders, strong enough for you to beat on them in anger and frustration. I never rebelled against him in those moments. I didn't understand. And like a good father, he allowed me to feel what I felt. Many times we're aware of how we should feel. And if how you should feel doesn't match how you do feel, sometimes you may feel like you need to swallow it. Well, I didn't swallow it. I let it all out. And he gave me space. And when you don't understand how God's commandments are working out in your life, when you don't understand why he's asked you to do what you do, it's okay to express that to him. He won't fault you for asking. But I also need you to understand that he may not answer your question at all. You see, God didn't fault me for asking, but write this down. He didn't offer an explanation. Never once did he say, Moses, let me tell you why it feels like you've gone backward. No. Moses, let me explain how this is part of my plan. No. I asked why? He never answered why. And sometimes you won't get an answer either. When you're angry, it's easy to forget your place. Here I am talking to the maker of the heavens, to the one who by sheer force of will holds every fiber of every being together. And I said, I demand an explanation. What a joke. He did not owe me an explanation, nor does he owe you. And maybe sometimes he will. Sometimes God pulls back the curtain so you can see how your obedience is playing out in your life. But other times he says, no, just obey. When it feels like you're doing the right thing and it's going the wrong way, you may question and don't expect an answer. But here's what else I learned. And write this down. He didn't change the plan. God didn't change the plan. See, I thought that the plan had gone horribly wrong. I thought that I had done something or he had forgotten something. I thought somehow I had ruined it. But it was all part of the process. Do you know how he answered me? Do you know what his answer was to why, God, why? He said, Moses, go to Pharaoh and tell him to release the people. I did that, Lord. I did that. Did you forget you already told me? Why would they listen to me now? Moses, go to Pharaoh, tell him to release the people, and you will see. He didn't change the plan. Not one bit. And let me tell you, many times I decided to quit and leave. But I'm so grateful that I didn't. Because in the end, after a lot of pain, he did let the people go. The Almighty is never a liar. And he was true to his word, but it didn't come the way that I expected it to. And sometimes in your life, it won't come the way you expect it to. But I decided to trust and get back up and go again. And you should know, by the end of that time in Egypt, through no good of my own, but through the work of the Almighty, Pharaoh demanded that we leave. The Egyptians filled our carts with silver. By the time I was finished, I was respected by all of the Hebrews and the Egyptian court. Everyone knew that God was speaking through me, and none of that would have happened if I had quit when things started going the wrong way. I have a simple message for you to hold. I've traveled through time just to share this idea with you. You will find those times when you do just what God says and things don't move in the right direction. And when they do, here's what you must do. Write this down so you don't forget it. Say your piece and stay the course. You need to have permission to ask God why. It's not wrong. I believe it's healthy. But don't leave the plan. Stay the course. Stay the course. None of you are slaves. None of you have been called by God to march into the throne room of a king, but all of you have been called to do things that are difficult. All of you have been called to do things that are not natural, that don't come easily. All of you have been called to put yourself second so that you may put the Most High first. All of you have been called by our Messiah, our Savior, to deny yourself and to follow him. And sometimes that will take you backward before it takes you forward. For some of you, you may You may decide, okay, all that I have belongs to God. I'm going to give the first 10%. I'm going to give the tithe. I'm going to give the first cut of my income to God's purposes and the spiritual health of my community. Some of you may decide to tithe, and the next month, your transportation breaks down. God, why? How is this making life better? Say your piece, but stay the course. Some of you may decide, this boy that I'm in love with, he loves me, but we're not committed to each other. And God has told me to save sex for marriage. Some of you may go to this boy and say, we need to be abstinent until we're married, until we're committed for life. And he may, instead of respecting you, he may decide to leave you. Say your piece, but stay the course. Maybe you reach out to your father because he has wronged you so deeply and you've been holding on to that, but God has told you to forgive. Maybe you reach out to contact him, and instead of reconciliation, he lashes out at you and he insults you. God, how is this making things better? Say your piece and stay the course. Some of you, there's a friend, there's a classmate who gets mocked, ridiculed. Maybe they don't speak well. I know something about that. And you rise up to their defense because Christ has told you to speak up for those who can't speak up for themselves, to look after the lowly. Maybe you do exactly what you are supposed to do, and instead of making things better, they mock him even more and they mock you. God, why have you called me to this? Say your piece and stay the course. There will be times when obedience moves you backward. And I must be honest, there will be times when obedience costs you dearly. I did not realize when I was alive on earth how many other of my countrymen, how many of my people, both of birth and by association with the Messiah, how many of them there were. But I've heard the stories now. Stephen was faithful to God, and things never got better for him. They killed him. Peter was faithful to God, and he was thrown into prison. Paul was faithful to God, and he was beaten again and again. You may not ever receive forward motion in this life, but you must remember that the instructions of the Almighty are commands, not suggestions. And the cost of your adoption as a son or a daughter is obedience. Say your piece and tell him what you need, but stay the course. Because in the end, whether it's in this life or the next, there is blessing in obedience. I wish I could tell you that the rest of my life was smooth sailing. I made some mistakes along the way. But I stand here today as someone who is on the other side of eternity, looking back and saying, please don't give up. Don't leave the service of the Almighty. I didn't realize at that time, I didn't realize the great cost that he would give so that I could be forgiven. In my time, it was the blood of goats, it was the blood of lambs that made a temporary covering, that made a temporary atonement, but no animal could ever pay for the cost of a son of the King. Only our Savior himself could provide my forgiveness. Does that sacrifice not warrant obedience? Even in the face of opposition, even when you're moving backward? I would contend that it does. You will be given times to stray from the course. You will be given times when it is so easy to leave and say, I'm done. I will no longer follow you. Your commands have caused nothing but trouble for my life. When you hit those moments, don't quit. The path is not broken, and neither are you. Say your piece. Stay the course. Hey, this is Pastor Chris again. Thanks for listening. If today's talk was helpful in your spiritual life, odds are there's someone you know who could benefit from it. Take a minute right now to share it with them. And if you live in the area, come try out a service in person, because church is more fun with friends. See you next time.